Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you keep up with the race, going through a number of very important aspects of what should become a comprehensive textile strategy. We are a bit short of time, so we are pushing this a little bit the limits, but bear with us. We spoke about the sustainability side of our strategy, which is essential, of course. Now we briefly touched upon the innovation and digitalization, and linked to that the necessity to address the skills dimension of our sector. And now in the third place, we would like to briefly touch upon, I would say, the global dimension of such a textile strategy. I mean, the textile industry is one of the most globalized, internationalized sectors of the European economy. And I refer to the recent industrial strategy document, which was released a couple of weeks ago, benchmarking 14 different ecosystems across the economy. And textiles is certainly not the largest sector of the economy, but it is the second most internationalized sector. So if you want to develop a comprehensive, effective strategy for our industry, it's clear that we need to look into this global dimension. So how does the European textile industry fit in that global context? And for that, we have also here a very interesting panel. I'm very happy to have Ignacio Garcia Bercero from the European Commission DG Trade with us, Judith Kirton-Darling, Deputy Secretary General from IndustriAll, so representing the European trade unions, and thirdly, Franz-Peter Falke, CEO of the Falke Group, so an entrepreneur's perspective. So let's move on swiftly and immediately. I hope my colleagues are on the screen. I still see Yves appearing. So if I can immediately pass the floor to Ignacio, a well-known figure, I can say, in the Brussels bubble when it comes to trade policy, trade negotiations. Ignacio has been leading negotiations with the US, with Korea, Japan, and much more. And of course, has been very much involved in this new EU trade strategy, which is trying to set, I would say, a new framework for European business in this kind of global context. Ignacio, you also know about the industrial strategy, which has been presented a couple of weeks ago. And so I would say, opening question to you would be, how do you see the textile sector fitting within this new policy framework? The trade strategy talking about enforcement, talking about level playing fields, the industrial strategy talking about resilience. So how can we come to a coherent policy from a European perspective that would support our textile companies? So Ignacio, I give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Dirk, and it's a big pleasure to have again the opportunity to talk to EURATEX. I think it's certainly one of the many occasions I have come to discuss with you the evolution of European Union trade policy. You have referred to the strategic document that was adopted by the Commission in 18th February, which is aiming to define a trade policy that responds to the new challenges related to the new geopolitical conflict of tension between the United States and China, which has, of course, profound implications on the trade policy, but also challenges of economic nature linked to the digitalization dimension that you were referring in your previous paragraph, and linked to the ambitions of Europe, and not only of Europe, to be a climate neutral continent by 2050. Which is, of course, going to have profound implications for all European policies, including the trade policy. What I would like to do is just basically to highlight a few issues which I think could be of particular relevance to the textiles sector. And then, of course, I will be very happy to, in the discussion, to go into some of them or others in more detail. Now, if you look into the trade policy strategy, it is clear that in order to develop an effective trade policy, we need to look into what we can do within a multilateral setting, and that's why we have given a particular priority to reforming the WTO, to ensuring that the rules of the WTO are up to date, which they currently are not. Also, of course, to the bilateral dimension, what we can do through our bilateral engagements, through free trade agreements or through other instruments, but also what it is that we can do autonomously through our own instruments, of course, acting consistently with our international obligations. So looking into these three dimensions and with a very much focus on the issue about what needs to be done to assure a level playing field in an industry like textiles, which is also a very internationally oriented industry for which exports matter, I would say two critical priorities at the multilateral level. None of them easy, none of them things which are going to be solved between now and the end of the year, which are of fundamental strategic importance. One is that we need to find a way to restore a functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO. That is critical for ensuring that we have a rule-based trading system. It is critical to be able to defend our interests vis-a-vis protectionist measures they adopted by third countries. And therefore, we need to find a way to work towards a reform of the dispute settlement system. Now, we hope that the new US administration is going to be ready to engage in a manner which the previous one wasn't. It's still early days, and I can assure you that a lot of the effort is also being done to establish a good working relationship with the new Biden administration on trade, which, by the way, we already have had some positive results, and we're having a EU-US summit in 2 weeks' time. And I think this will also be an occasion to further discuss trade with the United States. But it is clear that a strong priority for us is to find a way to restore a functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO. The other critical priority in terms of the level playing field is modernizing the rules on industrial subsidies and on the activities of state-owned enterprises. We know that these are issues which are having profoundly distortive impact on international trade. It is China, but it's not only China. It is an issue in which we actually need to be sure that the rules of trade when it comes to industrial subsidies are more effective. It is a work that we had started developing already with the previous US administration, where we started discussing with the United States and Japan a blueprint for the reform of the rules of trade on industrial subsidies. And this is something on which we hope very much to be able to, over the next few months, to come forward with proposals, not only by the European Union, but by a larger coalition of like-minded countries. Now, it's not an issue which is going to be solved quickly. Creating the right pressure and incentives for China to engage is obviously going to be critical, because any effective discipline on subsidies needs to include China. But again, it's one of the fundamental strategic priorities. When it comes to the bilateral agenda, and again with a focus on the level playing field, I mean, as you know, in our free trade agreements, we normally do not deal in detail with issues relating to subsidies, because these are issues that are better tackled in a broader multilateral setting. We have, of course, rules relating to sustainable development, labor, and environment. And one of the issues that we are going to be undertaking this year is a review of the implementation of our sustainable development chapters in our trade agreements. Some people believe that we should go in the direction of a stronger enforcement, including perhaps the possibility of trade sanctions. And this is one of the issues that we're going to be looking at. I would like, however, to mention one issue in the trade policy review, which I think could potentially be also significant for the textile industry, and that this is the first time, I believe, we have specifically identified trade and investment relationship with Africa as a central priority for European Union trade policy. I say that because, of course, Africa also has potential significance for the textile sector. I think there is also a need to look into issues like nearshoring, to what extent certain activities could also be developed in partnership with Africa. Not only, of course, the Maghreb, also other countries in the African continent. And one of the important issues that we are going to be putting a lot of effort in European Union trade policy, working closely together with our colleagues responsible for development cooperation, is how to facilitate European investment in the countries in Africa, and how to try to be sure that there is a better integration of Africa into a common value chain. And by the way, one of the issues that we are going to be reflecting in this connection, and I mentioned that because I know it's an issue in which the textile industry is always very interested, is all the dimension relating to rules of origin. To what extent there should be some further thought being given to how rules of origin could facilitate the creation of African value chains, which are closely integrated to Europe. And that's an idea that we mentioned in our trade policy review, that is still very much reflecting about what this could imply in practice. Finally, just very quickly, it is very important that we bear in mind that it is not only what we can do through negotiations, it is also what we can do through the development of our own toolbox, our own instruments to ensure a level playing field. And from that connection, I would basically refer to three issues. One is a very strong focus on implementation and enforcement, which follows from the creation of the post of the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer. I think we will be quite forward-looking in terms of making sure that when we are facing obstacles in certain countries which are unfair, which are contrary to international commitments, that we react. And I think that's something that is very much reflected in this new mindset of giving greater priority to implementation and enforcement. There are also questions relating to the development of our own trade policy instruments. We have recently modernized our trade defense instruments, and I think that we are applying them, I think, quite effectively. So we are not thinking at this point in time to introduce changes when it comes to anti-dumping or when it comes to countervailing duty legislation, but we are certainly applying our countervailing duty legislation significantly aggressively, I would say, including testing some new ideas in terms of how the rules can be applied. But there's also some important legislative developments. After many, many years, I think we now finally have a common position of the Council on the international procurement instrument, whose objective is to ensure reciprocity in the procurement markets. And now that we have a common position in the Council, we hope it will be possible to move the legislative procedure fast towards the adoption of legislation on this matter. And we have very recently presented a new legislative proposal, which is basically trying to address how to ensure that we can react when foreign subsidies are having a distortive impact in the European single market. Now, we have, of course, strict domestic rules when it comes to state aid, but these rules only apply to subsidies applied by the member states. If there is a subsidy which is provided by a foreign government to a company which is operating in the single market, where it is through acquisitions, where it is through procurement or otherwise, this is something which currently was not really subject to disciplines, unless, of course, there were imports, in which case the trade defense instrument takes place. But this issue is not limited to imports. So this is one important dimension. And then very, very quickly,
last point, just because we look at the time, sorry.
It will be one minute.
Okay.
Let's not forget that there are some initiatives which are not really trade policy, but will have important trade policy impact. It's obviously the border carbon adjustment measure, which of course will not apply to the textile sector. I think everyone knows that, but it is clearly going to be an important initiative. And then there's, of course, the whole debate about mandatory due diligence, with a particularly focus on the issue of forced labor and how to avoid that forced labor products are put in the European market. But of course, I could imagine that that is also an issue of impact and significance for the textile sector. So I would leave it at that.
Thank you, Ignacio. Sorry for cutting you a little bit short, but time is indeed running. But at the same time, there is indeed a long list of initiatives that you summarized in those few minutes. Thank you for that. Let's actually immediately move on to Judith Kirton-Darling, talking about due diligence, talking about social standards. I'm sure this is something that is on top of the agenda of the European Trade Union. So Judith, I want you to come in immediately with your perspective on that, and maybe more broadly, how do you see this textile strategy from a trade union perspective? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dirk, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this afternoon. Obviously, for IndustriAll Europe, EURATEX is a very valued sectoral social partner. So we're looking forward to a very lively debate with you and your members as we work through the next few months and see what's in the textile strategy as it comes out. But I guess the starting point from our perspective is that we can't have any really substantive debate about a sustainable textile strategy if we only talk about environmental sustainability. Sustainability has three dimensions. All too often the social dimension is left to one side and is seen as a minor part of the mix, but in fact, in terms of the competitiveness of European industry globally, the social sustainability of the industry is absolutely vital. And we can't talk about social sustainability without talking about trade policies and external policies. Ignacio has given a long list of all of the initiatives that the Commission are working on. From our perspective in the trade unions, we're defending workers' rights and improving working conditions in a global industry like the textiles industry, which we know is one of its key features in many countries is low wages and bad working conditions, and in some cases deadly working conditions. That we have to have an assertive agenda around labour standards, and that agenda around labour standards for us comes down to also a discussion about the business models in the sector and tackling the corrosive nature of fast fashion in terms of working conditions globally. So when we're talking about business models, we also have to factor in that social dimension. Now, if we're talking about what's coming up in terms of the trade agenda, how we integrate that within the textile agenda, then I think for us there are three topics. Two Ignacio hasn't mentioned, one he has, which are really of significant importance. The one which was mentioned is the review of trade and sustainable development chapters. We're looking at greater enforcement and monitoring of how those chapters are implemented is of primordial importance for the trade union movement. And I had a wry smile when Ignacio said there are those who are calling for stronger enforcement and a sanctions-based model, and the trade union movement is unanimous in its support for a far stronger agenda. And there are examples that we can build on. If you look at, for example, the successor to NAFTA, the USMCA in the US, they have enforcement also at site level, at company level for violations. So not blanket brush attacks, if you like, across whole sectors or countries, but actually very targeted enforcement to ensure the enforcement of ILO standards. The other two, which haven't been mentioned, but are really important for us and for our textile workers, are the review of and the revision of the GSP regulation, which we're expecting this year. And how we see it is in some ways two sides of the coin, an improvement in terms of in the GSP revision, in terms of the monitoring and the enforcement of ILO conventions for GSP recipients. And the other side of the coin, if you like, is the sustainable corporate governance package and mandatory human rights due diligence. So the responsibilities of businesses, European businesses, to be monitoring and ensuring due diligence down their supply chains. This for us is about strengthening the instruments of that social dimension so that we can improve living and working conditions around the world. And I know we're running out of time, so my last comment to save you a bit of time is that for us as trade unions, you give people the opportunity to improve their conditions locally. That is what the ILO standards are about. It's enabling conditions so that workers locally can negotiate to improve their own standards. These are not European values being imposed. These are international standards being applied. And a worker in Bangladesh or a worker in Pakistan has the same hope that they go to work able to come home with a pay which supports their family, and that a working place which is safe enough that they come home at the end of the day. So these are common concerns held across the trade union movement, and one really strong signal that the European industry could send, and brands and textile companies, would be to use the 3-month extension of the Bangladesh Accord to really negotiate a binding agreement in terms of ensuring that healthy, safe workplaces right around the world. So governments have a role, the European Commission has a role, but we as social partners also have a strong role, and we look forward to that discussion with you, Dirk, and your members.
That'll certainly be an interesting discussion, Judith. Thank you. Thank you for that trade union perspective. And I think when I didn't touch upon it when opening that panel, what is important from EURATEX perspective when addressing that global dimension is to be very clearly about who is who when talking about the textile industry, and that there are indeed very important differences about European textile companies versus other, let's say, textile companies in that global environment. So it's very important to bring that nuance, to bring that differentiation when addressing some of these issues. But let's maybe move immediately to Franz-Peter Falke, the CEO of the Falke Group, a German successful company in the legwear, socks, I think famous products, selling around 60 countries, I think, Franz-Peter, around the world, having been very successful, and at the same time very committed to this family-owned company, make it grow for the company, for its workers. So Franz-Peter, what is your, let's say, experience towards this global dimension, international competition? What is the maybe key for success for you, for your company, to be competitive on this globalized markets? Happily give you the floor.
Thanks, Dirk. Good afternoon to everyone. Well, what is the key success? Let me go maybe a bit in principle and give you a background of the thinking of our company, which I think is one of the relevant elements to focus, like having a compass in doing so and being still alive in a very competitive textile clothing business. Since our founding year in 1895, the key to our company's success has always been our entrepreneurial spirit, enthusiasm, and passion for creating value for our customers and, as a result, of course, for the society. Our mission, modern clothing for modern people, it's a permanent imperative for us as a company and as a promise to our customers. We understand modernity as a permanent anticipation, sensing and analyzing future developments, their opportunities and their risks. On the basis of careful reflection, this results in dynamic design assignments that we implement responsibly and systematically into the company. They are supported by comprehensive curiosity, a fundamental openness to new ideas, and are always based on a holistic thinking. Only in this way can creativity unfold, and only in this way can innovations emerge that find sufficient resonance in the creativity society. Only through relevant information, through sense-making differentiation, can we create a concise profile as a company. And only in this way can we distinguish ourselves as a brand in the sense of a trustworthy performance promise. Only in this way we respect and trust of our customers worldwide in the long term, and thus ensure the future vitality of our company. However, This entrepreneurial spirit, entrepreneurial freedom, agility, and personal responsibility have been lately increasingly limited, sometimes openly, sometimes subtly by governmental and non-governmental organizations, to my opinion, to the detriment of society. It should also be not overlooked that companies are not necessarily afraid to call on the state where individual responsibility is called for. If we want to prevent the negative consequences of the resulting restrictions, I think a new understanding of the role of state in particular is required. The state must create basic conditions for dynamic actions under fair, competitive conditions by providing a complex, forward-looking infrastructure in a highly efficient manner. It must be remodeled to meet the requirements of the knowledge society, the creativity society, and the compelling conditions of climate change and globalization. And only in this way, I think, are decisive framework conditions set for effective and efficient competition. A competition that accepts the necessary change, that is prepared to actively accept the obvious risk of this change and to transform them into new solutions. And a competition that takes place under fair and transparent conditions. Dirk, let me be a little bit more precise. What do we need from European policymakers to secure our international competitive in these challenging times? I think I mentioned the importance of free and fluid global value chains for us as a company, for us as a textile clothing industry, but for us as Europeans. I think we have to understand the full extent of global competition. The EU, to my opinion, cannot afford anymore to design its policies without considering the developments in other key regions of the world. I'm just mentioning RCEP. I think the EU will need to have good answers as to how we can ensure our competitiveness in the long run under the framework conditions imposed by the EU. To this end, we need more focus on market economy and open markets. The goals pursued by the European Green Deal are laudable, but I think still we should not lose sight of the benefits of free trade. We need more focus again on market access for imports and exports. In these weeks and months, a number of stakeholders and policymakers are calling for more resilience. I do agree that we need resilience, but not to create trade barriers around Europe, but to secure the fluidity of the value chain on which we as a strongly globalized sector indispensably depend. We need to strengthen multilateralism. Global challenges require solutions with a critical number of players around the table. With the new US administration, there is now a 3-year window available. We need to adapt. We need to restore the WTO, it's already mentioned, to improve its function, and a stable, reliable, rule-based multilateral trading system is a key of prerequisite for orderly business in our globalized world. Plurilateral initiatives can be useful to complement this pursuit. We need to conclude and rectify more EU FTAs with more ambition and quicker. The WTO and plurilaterals are good, but they are not enough. We need to engage more and more ambitiously with our key trading partners, although through bilateral trade agreements. At a time when our continent is struggling to recover from the COVID-19, it is a tragedy that the EU member states are still unable to harvest the fruits, for instance, of the EU-Mercosur agreement, which would act as a major boost to growth and jobs in our industry. We need the new US administration in office. We can finally bring our transatlantic trade relations on track. I think we were talking about Mr. Bercero, about the Garcia Bercero, about the TTIP negotiations. I think it was sure how much potential is in signing of these in this agreement. We need to adapt trade rules to the progress in research and economy. A number of trade agreements now in force are made for a world that has long changed. Digitalization, artificial intelligence, e-commerce, data, and more phenomena present new challenges and offer new opportunities. If we want trade policy rules to be relevant, also in the future, they need constant adaptation. The same goes for the closely related regularity issues whose complexity lays a heavy strain on many companies, SMEs and also larger companies. Here we need more harmonization and regularity cooperation to help those economic operators find their way. And I think we need to simplify rules. Simplification is the big missing word in the EU trading policy strategy. When using the search function in your software and browsing through the Commission's communication, you will not find the word simple only one single time. This is unfortunate, I think, given that regulatory complexity counts among the most harmful non-tariff barriers to trade. The lack of focus on simplification in the trade strategy is all the more astonishing, as in the past, the EU has made good efforts to conclude the WTO agreement on trade facilitation and to provide us with a simple, stable, and predictable GSP. Today,
I'm looking at the time. We have to be careful because we are running a little bit late, and if we can.
Okay, and let me finish. Last but not least, we need to be realistic when we discuss viable policy options at the end of the COVID-19 time. That goes at the current discussion on EU carbon border adjustment mechanism and for EU legislation on mandatory due diligence. These debates and others like in the field of chemicals policy require a broader view than some in the EU are currently taking. Sustainability will only work in the long run, to my opinion, if we address all three pillars, also the economic one. The competitiveness of our industry needs to be properly reflected in all EU policy moves, also under the Green Deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz-Peter. Sorry to interrupt, but again, the time is running fast, and the list of issues under this global dimension is indeed, I would say, impressively long. As Ignacio started, Judith adding a number of other elements, and then Franz-Peter from a corporate perspective, insisting on some of these points. Unfortunately, I would say at this stage, we don't have time to enter into a longer discussion. I do apologize to our speakers and the many participants, but we certainly take on board what has been said. And by the way, and I speak here as a EURATEX DG, we will of course look into the different questions that have been posted on the Q&A and try to come back to some of you individually, bilaterally, to address those questions, to engage in a debate. But again, in the interest of time, again, my apologies, but well, thanks to the speakers. Apologies for cutting a little bit short, but we need to move on because I know other people have engagements later on this afternoon. What I would like to do now is to quickly give the floor to EURATEX Vice President Jean-François Gribomont for a few final quick comments from EURATEX perspective. And then afterwards, we will have Simona Bonafé from the Intergroup to make her closing remarks. Jean-François, if I may kindly invite you to just share a few comments from what you have heard this afternoon, and then afterwards, Ms. Bonafé. Thank you.